He lived in a world of polished marble and echoing silence, a fortress he'd built with his fortune. He hired her to clean his mansion. He never expected her to expose the mess in his own heart. This is the story of Alistair Blackwood, a man who built his life like one of his architectural marvels, cold, perfect, and completely empty. His empire was vast, his name whispered with awe and fear in boardrooms across the globe. His home, a sprawling estate of glass and stone, wasn't a sanctuary. It was a museum to his own success. Every surface gleamed, every corner was sharp, and it was a home designed to be looked at, not lived in. Alistair moved through its halls like a ghost, the only sound his own footsteps in the oppressive quiet. He was the king of a silent, lonely kingdom. And then there was Elara Vance. She didn't storm the gates of his fortress. She came in through the service door, armed with a dustcloth and a quiet resilience that was tougher than any corporate raider he'd ever faced. She came from a world painted in warmer colors, a world of close family, shared laughter, and the gentle hum of a life lived with more heart than money. She needed the job. The salary was astronomical to her, to care for her mother, whose medical bills were a looming shadow. Elara expected to be invisible, a nameless part of the staff meant to erase any disorder from Mr. Blackwood's perfect world. She was just supposed to be the help. But in a house that had forgotten what warmth felt like, her quiet light was about to cast a very long shadow. Alistair Blackwood didn't do clutter, emotional or otherwise. His days were partitioned into precise, billable minutes. His breakfast was the same every morning: black coffee, no sugar, and a glance at the global markets. He believed emotions were a liability, a messy complication that clouded judgment. His heart, he figured, was a well-run machine, pumping blood with the same dispassionate reliability as the stock ticker. He was wrong. He just hadn't met the one variable his controlled world couldn't account for. He hadn't met Elara. Elara's introduction to the Blackwood estate wasn't so much a welcome as it was an induction. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, was a woman carved from the same stern material as the mansion itself. She was severe, efficient, and spoke in clipped sentences that left no room for error. "Mr. Blackwood's standards are absolute," Mrs. Gable stated, her voice echoing in the grand two-story foyer. "There is a place for everything, and everything must be in its place. You are here to maintain order, not to disturb it. You will be heard from as little as possible, and seen even less." Elara just nodded, her gaze sweeping over the vast, intimidating space. It was beautiful, the way a glacier is beautiful, majestic, awe-inspiring, and profoundly cold. The air itself felt different here, thin and sterile, scrubbed clean of any scent of life. Her small apartment, with the lingering smell of her mother's herbal tea and the worn fabric of their old sofa, felt a universe away. Her first real encounter with the master of the house happened on her third day. She was in the West Wing Gallery, a long, sun-drenched corridor lined with abstract sculptures. Her task was to dust them, a process Mrs. Gable had demonstrated with the seriousness of a sacred ritual. Elara was carefully wiping down a twisted spire of chrome when she heard the rapid, angry click of expensive shoes on the marble floor. Alistair Blackwood rounded the corner, a phone pressed to his ear, his face a mask of thunderous fury. He wasn't walking, he was storming, a human tempest in a dark suit. "Unacceptable," he bit out into the phone. "Liquidate the position. I don't care about the fallout. Make it happen." He didn't see her at all. In his world, people like her were just part of the scenery. Trying to get out of his way, Elara took a hasty step back, her elbow bumping the stand of a smaller sculpture. The piece, a delicate cascade of interlocking glass, wobbled. A gasp caught in her throat as she reached out, her hands steadying the artwork just before it could fall. The near disaster was enough to break Alistair's laser focus. He stopped, lowered his phone, and his cold grey eyes finally landed on her. It wasn't a look of concern for her, or even for the art. It was pure, unfiltered annoyance. "Watch what you're doing," he said, his voice low and sharp, each word a shard of ice. He didn't wait for a response. His gaze swept over her simple uniform as if she were a smudge on the wall. Then, with a final dismissive glance, he turned and continued his march, resuming his call as if she had never existed. Ilara stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding not from fear, but from the sheer force of his presence. She'd never been looked at like that before, like she was nothing more than an inconvenient object. A flicker of indignation sparked inside her, but she quickly smothered it. She needed this job. She straightened her back, took a deep breath, and turned back to the sculpture. Her hands were steady as she resumed her work, but a quiet resolve settled in her heart. She wouldn't be intimidated by him. She would do her job well and hold on to her dignity, the one thing that wasn't for sale. In the days that followed, Alistair began to notice her, though he'd never admit it. He prided himself on his observation skills. They'd made him a fortune. And he noticed Ilara. From his second-floor office, he'd see her moving through the gardens below, tending to flower beds that had been neglected for years. He found himself watching her on the estate's security feeds, a habit he justified as monitoring his assets. He saw her in the grand ballroom, not just wiping down chandeliers, but pausing to look up, a small, wistful smile on her face, as if she could hear the ghosts of old music. He heard her too. One afternoon a faint sound drifted up from the floor below. It was a soft, melodic humming, a simple tune that wove its way through the oppressive silence of the house. It was a sound of contentment, of life, and it was utterly foreign in that place. Alistair scowled, annoyed at the distraction. He buzzed Mrs. Gable. "There is a noise," he stated, "in the main hall. See to it." A few minutes later, the humming stopped. The familiar, sterile silence returned, but for the first time it didn't feel peaceful. It just felt empty. The absence of her simple tune had created a void. He found himself irritated, a strange restlessness stirring within him. He had paid for silence and invisibility, yet the quiet presence of this one woman was proving to be the most disruptive force his world had ever encountered. The change in Alistair wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone, happening in small moments that chipped away at the fortress around his heart. The first real crack appeared in the library. It was Alistair's sanctuary, a cathedral of leather-bound books and the scent of old paper. Staff had strict instructions: clean before 9 a.m. and never touch the books on his desk. One evening, searching for a file, he entered the library long after everyone should have gone home. And there she was. Ilara wasn't dusting. She was standing before a high shelf, her head tilted, her fingers gently tracing the spine of a worn green book. His first instinct was fury, a violation of his rules. "This room is off limits," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. Ilara jumped, startled, and spun around. A flush of color rose in her cheeks, but her eyes, when they met his, weren't afraid. "I apologize, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steady. "I had finished for the day, and I saw this." He followed her gaze to the book, a collection of old poetry. "You are paid to clean, not to browse," he said coolly. "I know," she replied softly. "It's just, this was my father's favorite." She looked back at the book, a flicker of unguarded emotion in her eyes. "He used to read it to me. He said poetry was the soul's way of speaking when ordinary words weren't enough. I haven't seen a copy in years." Alistair was silent. He'd expected an excuse, a stammered apology. He had not expected a simple, heartfelt truth. For a second, he didn't see an employee who had broken a rule, but a daughter missing her father. It disarmed him. He thought of his own father, who had only ever spoken in the language of disappointment. The contrast was a sharp pang in his chest. He cleared his throat. "See that you don't make a habit of it," he said, his tone clipped, but lacking its usual bite. He turned and walked away. He went to his office and stood for a long time, staring out at the dark lawns, the echo of her words, the soul's way of speaking, replaying in his mind. The second crack came a week later. A multi-billion-dollar merger he'd orchestrated for months had suddenly hit a snag. He spent hours on calls, his voice growing sharper with each passing minute. When he finally slammed the phone down, a headache was pulsing at his temples. He stalked out of his office, heading for the kitchen, his mood as black as his coffee. As he passed a small service table in the hallway, he noticed something new. A single steaming cup of tea on a small saucer. Next to it was a small, handwritten note. "For the headache," it read. "Chamomile and lavender. It helps." He stopped, staring. His first reaction was suspicion. Who did this? He was about to summon Mrs. Gable when the fragrant steam reached him. On a strange impulse, he picked up the mug. It was warm in his hands. He took a hesitant sip. The tea was soothing, its warmth spreading through his chest, loosening the tight knot of tension in his shoulders. Someone had noticed his stress, not because they were afraid of his temper, but because they saw his pain. The next day, he made a discreet inquiry. Mrs. Gable, confused, informed him that Ilara had a small herb garden and often made teas for the other staff. Alistair said nothing, but he filed it away. He had been seen, not as a boss, but as a man with a headache. The thought was strangely unsettling, and even more strangely, comforting. He started altering his routines, almost subconsciously, to cross her path. He'd take his coffee on the terrace, knowing she would be tending the roses below. He learned her story in fragments, from snippets of phone calls she'd take on her break. Hearing her encourage her mother, her voice a balm of optimism, or laugh with her sister about a funny movie. He contrasted her warmth in the face of real struggles with the transactional conversations that filled his own life. The people in his circle only talked of what they could get from him. Ilara spoke of what she could give. The moment that shifted everything from intrigue to something protective came with Genevieve Sinclair. An heiress from his past, Genevieve was beautiful, sharp, and possessed a cruelty she disguised as wit. She found Alistair on the veranda, while Ilara was quietly sweeping nearby. Genevieve's eyes slid over Ilara with disdain. "Darling," she purred to Alistair, "you really must get better help. The agency that sent this one must service the lower boroughs." Before Alistair could react, Ilara straightened up, her expression calm. "Is there something you require, ma'am?" she asked politely. Genevieve gave a brittle laugh. "Oh, it speaks. How quaint. No, thank you. Just try to remain invisible. That's what you're paid for, isn't it?" Ilara's gaze didn't waver. "I'm paid to maintain the estate, ma'am. Invisibility, I find, is a matter of perception. Some people are very good at overlooking what is right in front of them." Genevieve's face tightened with fury, but Alistair cut her off. "That's enough, Genevieve." His voice was dangerously quiet. He was looking at Ilara, but really seeing her for the first time, a woman of immense grace, standing her ground with more class than the heiress had ever possessed. The final piece of his armor shattered during a ferocious storm that knocked out the power. The mansion plunged into darkness. Even the emergency generators failed. For a man who craved control, this was chaos. Stumbling through the dark of his own home, he saw a soft, moving light. He followed it to the main hall, where Ilara was calmly lighting candles. She wasn't panicked, she was resourceful. A small island of tranquility. "The main breaker must have tripped," she said as he approached. "I found the emergency candles." He just stood there, watching the candlelight dance in her eyes. The storm raged outside, but inside the small circle of light she had created, it was peaceful. "You're not afraid," he stated. She smiled. "It's just a storm, Mr. Blackwood. The power will come back on. It always does. Sometimes, a little darkness helps you appreciate the light." In the flickering candlelight, he found himself talking. He told her about the storms of his childhood, of building walls of wealth and solitude to escape the chaos. He'd never told anyone that. As he spoke, he moved closer, drawn by a warmth that had nothing to do with the candles. The air grew thick. He could smell the faint scent of lavender and rain on her. He reached out, his fingers brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. And just as they were about to meet, the chandeliers blazed to life, flooding the hall with unforgiving light. The spell was broken. They sprang apart, the moment gone, but the tension it left behind was a living, breathing thing. The final confrontation was orchestrated by Genevieve Sinclair. Humiliated by a maid, she decided to get Ilara fired and destroyed. She returned to the mansion and, finding a moment when Ilara was alone in the drawing room, She slipped her own diamond tennis bracelet into the side pocket of Ilara's cleaning tote. An hour later, the performance began. "My bracelet!" she cried, rushing to Alistair's study. "My mother's diamond bracelet, it's gone!" Mrs. Gable was summoned. The staff were questioned. Then, with a look of malicious realization, Genevieve pointed a trembling finger toward Ilara. "Her," she said, her voice dripping with false regret. "She was the only other person in the room with me. You must search her things." It was an ugly, public accusation. The power dynamic was a chasm. All eyes turned to Alistair, expecting a cold, swift judgment. Alistair's face was a mask. He looked at Genevieve's teary-eyed performance. Then his gaze settled on Ilara. She stood tall, her face pale, but her eyes were steady, meeting his without a hint of fear. In her gaze he saw an unshakable integrity. "Search her bag," Genevieve demanded. "That won't be necessary," Alistair said, his voice cutting through the tension. He walked slowly toward Genevieve. "It's a beautiful bracelet," he said softly. "So beautiful that I noticed it the moment you walked in. I also noticed the rather clumsy way you adjusted it near the fireplace, right in view of the security camera in the corner." Genevieve's face went white. Alistair continued, his voice now glacial. "A camera whose footage I have just reviewed. It clearly shows you slipping the bracelet into the bag yourself." He held up his tablet. The damning footage paused on the screen. "You are a poison, Genevieve." He then turned to Ilara, his voice softening but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Ilara Vance has more honor in her little finger than you have in your entire family. Her character is the single most valuable thing in this house." He looked back at Genevieve. "You will leave now. And if I ever see or hear from you again, I will release this footage to every news outlet on the planet. I believe the term is going viral. Get out." Stunned into silence, Genevieve fled. A collective, relieved breath was exhaled by the staff. But Alistair only had eyes for Ilara. He had defended her, chosen her. The line had been crossed. The aftermath was charged. Ilara had been vindicated, but she knew she couldn't stay. With a heavy heart, she packed her few belongings and wrote a simple resignation letter. She was slipping out the service door when his voice stopped her. "Where are you going?" Alistair stood at the end of the hall, his suit jacket gone, his tie loosened. His usual composure was gone. "I can't stay, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "After today, it's not right." "What isn't right?" he asked, walking toward her. "That I told the truth. That you shouldn't have to," she replied, looking up at him. "Your world and my world, they don't mix. It will only cause more problems for you." "My world," he said with a humorless laugh. "My world was a sterile, silent vacuum until you walked into it. It was a house, not a home. You are my world, Ilara." He was standing right in front of her now, his eyes pleading, stripped of all arrogance. He was raw, open, vulnerable. "I hired you to clean my mansion," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you did so much more. You dusted off my heart. You opened the windows and let the light in. You showed me what a mess my life really was." He reached out, his hand gently taking hers. "Please don't go," he whispered. "I know this is complicated. All I know is that if you walk out that door, all the light goes with you. Stay. Stay and let me show you that this mansion can be a home. That my heart can be one, too." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes. She saw the truth of his transformation, the genuine, painful, beautiful change she had accidentally caused. In his face she saw the lonely man behind the fortress. She thought of her father's poetry, of the soul's way of speaking. And in that moment, their souls were speaking the same language. She squeezed his hand, a small smile blooming on her face. "Okay, Alistair," she said, saying his first name for the very first time. "Okay." 3 months later, the Blackwood estate was unrecognizable, not in its structure, but in its spirit. Laughter now echoed in the halls. The grand piano, once a silent monument, was now the source of clumsy but joyful duets. The gardens now included a thriving, slightly messy herb patch and a section of the wildflowers Ilara loved. Alistair himself was a changed man. The hard lines around his eyes had softened into crinkles of laughter. He still ran his empire, But he now valued the people behind the profits. He made time. He took weekends off. One sunny afternoon, he and Ilara were sitting on the grass with a picnic basket, an activity he once would have called laughably inefficient. She was reading to him from the worn green book of poetry. His head was in her lap, his eyes closed as he listened to her voice. She paused, and he opened his eyes to look up at her, his expression full of a love so profound it was breathtaking. "You know," he said softly, "this is the most successful merger I've ever been a part of." She smiled, brushing his hair back. "The joining of two very different companies." "No," he corrected gently, "the discovery that we were never really separate to begin with." The great mansion loomed behind them, but it no longer looked like a fortress. It looked like a home, finally alive, its heart beating in time with the two people who had taught each other how to live. Comment below if you believe true love can bridge any divide, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that warm the heart.